The Spin-off Podcast Network.
This podcast is supported by Progressive, a leader in RV insurance. RVs are for sharing adventures with family, friends, and even your pets. So if you bring your cats and dogs along for the ride, you'll want Progressive RV insurance. They protect your cats and dogs like family by offering up to $1,000 in optional coverage for vet bills in case of an RV accident, making it a great companion for the responsible pet owner who loves to travel. See Progressive's other benefits and more when you quote RV insurance at Progressive.com today. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Pet injury is an additional coverage and subject to policy terms.
Mic check. 1, 2. Are we recording? Hi, I'm Michelle Bernstein, an award-winning chef, restaurateur, and mom. I have a lot on my plate, including my psoriatic arthritis symptoms. That's why I was prescribed Cosentyx. It helps me move better.
Cosentyx secukinumab is prescribed for people 2 years of age and older with active psoriatic arthritis. Don't use if you're allergic to Cosentyx. Before starting, get checked for tuberculosis. An increased risk of infections and lowered ability to fight them may occur, like tuberculosis or other serious bacterial, fungal, or viral infections. Some were fatal. Tell your doctor if you have an infection or symptoms like fevers, sweats, chills, muscle aches, or cough, had a vaccine or plan to, or if inflammatory bowel disease symptoms develop or worsen. Serious allergic reactions and severe eczema-like skin reactions may occur. Learn more at 1-844-COSENTYX or Cosentyx.com.
Ask your rheumatologist about Cosentyx.
Tēnā koutou katoa, welcome to Gone By Lunchtime. I'm Toby Manhire, Annabelle Lee-Mather. Kia ora.
Kia ora.
Ben Thomas, how are you?
Yeah, good. Just, what are we? We're midway through scrutiny week.
Oh yes, exciting. Have you scrutinised anything yet?
I have not. I looked at one of the live streams and it was a bit dull. I heard that Labour were swearing at or around David Seymour.
Yeah. Was it Ginny Anderson said, "For fuck's sake," apologies to listeners for that, I'm just quoting. And then David Seymour said, no, tell us what you said. And she said, oh, I said for fuck's sake, but I shouldn't have said for fuck's sake. And then there was a shit. Was there a shit?
There was a Duncan Webb was interrogating Seymour because you know how I think when Scrutiny Week, which is a new development, it was only brought in last year.
This is the third round of it, perhaps.
This is there's two per year, but this mid-year one is the one where they kind of haul the ministers in front of the select committees and really interrogate them about the votes. And I think people had in mind that it would be this, like these fiery congressional hearings on CNN, these sort of McCarthy kind of trial sort of things. And in typical New Zealand fashion, it's it tends to be a bunch of people sort of shuffling papers and trying to remember what they were going to ask, and what had come up in the AI Google window when they put in transport policy in NZ. But
a good idea though. We get officials as well before the committees, don't we?
You do get the officials, yeah. And look, some interesting things come up. So there was some interesting comments in the whatever the Office of Treaty Settlements has been renamed that I can't quite remember now. Yesterday, so a disclosure by the minister that the Crown wouldn't be entering into any treaty settlements that acknowledged the Crown might not have sovereignty, which I feel like as a logical step makes sense. Otherwise, like, what are you doing signing the agreement?
That's true, but isn't the clause a kind of agree to disagree? We'll agree to disagree about this small matter.
It seems like a big thing to kind of agree to disagree. I mean, I think it's easier to not mention it at all.
Right.
Yeah.
I have a theory about all the swearing and the carry-on in Parliament recently. Me and Mahi were there a month or two ago. You may have seen it on the internet.
Oh, well, you seem to be in parts of the building that
in Parliament.
You shouldn't have been. Anyway, that's for another day.
And we went into Copperfields. Have you
Did you go with your camera and your boom mic into there?
We had to wait.
Storming and interrogating the staff.
Storming in, did a little investigation into what's being served. Have you guys heard the playlist at Copperfields?
Not consciously.
It's pretty full on, eh? It's like Eye of the Tiger, Billy Idol. Like the temperature in there is
Right.
hot.
Yes.
And
It's full hype music.
it's pretty hype, and it's sort of loud enough so that you can't hear the people bitching about you at the table next door.
Sure.
But just not loud enough that you can bitch about them to whoever's sitting next to you. And it's a very kind of high energy type playlist, and I just wonder if maybe if we were to draw from what you might hear when you're going to get a massage,
Yeah. More. You want
tinkly
more
little
kind
bells,
of
running
rainforest,
water, rainforest noises.
some of that, and this stuff, and they're just
Might
jogging out of Copperfields into the select committee room, ready for a fight.
I feel like it might take the temperature down a little bit.
Interesting. We should A/B
Try
test
it, guys.
some of that. Welcome also to Te Butler, who is, as ever, making the magic happen. The week with scrutiny happening in Parliament in Wellington, meanwhile, the Prime Minister is travelling around the world. He arrived this morning, New Zealand time, it's Wednesday, 18th of June, in Shanghai, I think, on the 757. Don't know how many stops it had to make on the way to Shanghai, but it got there.
The only other flying object older than that 757, I believe, is a pterodactyl.
Yeah. And there he is in Shanghai. And then I think going on to Beijing. And beyond that to NATO and Europe. But he arrives in China and into the world. There's a lot happening. I just jotted down some of the things, which is it's not a very exciting list. I mean, it's not a very uplifting list, rather. Israel and Iran at war. Winston Peters has urged New Zealanders in both countries to flee what he calls the arc of danger. Donald Trump, fresh from that military parade and the protests in response to that military parade, and he's doing a little bit of I want to be a demagogue, but he's been out-demagogued by more experienced players like Vladimir Putin and Benjamin Netanyahu.
He loves Vladimir, though.
He does.
He's hashtag goals.
And Trump has now left the G7 meeting in Canada to come try and do we know not what in regard to the Israel-Iran exchanges, attacks. Albanese was stood up at AUKUS. He was meant to have a meeting partly in relation to this idea that the Americans are reviewing AUKUS. Winston Peters, meanwhile, has said that tensions have not been so strained in the world in geopolitics since the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. And, like he is a student of international affairs.
We probably have to take his word for it.
Well, we take it seriously. New Zealand has,
if you say so.
New Zealand has, along with most of the five except the US, plus Norway, issued sanctions against those two far-right Israeli MPs, Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, over their positions and statements on settlements in the West Bank. There's been an open letter from Helen Clark and Don Brash and Geoffrey Palmer, I think, too, restating the position that they've articulated before relating to New Zealand's engagement with China and the suggestion that, in their view, a kind of taking of sides and abandoning that kind of bipartisan commitment to what they call a strategic partnership with China. David Carter chipped in as well. He's the chair of the China Friendship Society or something.
Can you read what Luxon said in response?
Yes, I'd like to do that. He was responding to was it Craig McCulloch maybe from RNZ? He said, "Mate," he said, "Mate, I'll just say, you want to listen a little less to former politicians, maybe listen to the ones that are in the arena right now."
It's giving Russell Crowe.
That's also, he's been listening
Gladiator vibes.
He's been listening to the playlist in Copperfields too.
Yeah.
He's like, step in the arena, pal.
And also every Labour minister who resigned or was sacked in their final year in government, all of whom on social media put up that Teddy Roosevelt quote about what matters is the man in the arena,
right.
not the critical in the
Was it
seats.
Roosevelt? Was it Roosevelt?
Yeah. Was it Roosevelt?
Yeah.
Wasn't it Teddy Roosevelt?
There's been an Asia-New Zealand poll, they put out their really excellent Perceptions of Asia survey every year, and it shows, probably not surprisingly, a growing sense of China as a threat, and how much of that's to do with political rhetoric, how much that's to do with China's actual activities around the region. Don't know. And trust in the US plunging to a record low. Look, it's a lot of stuff out there, Annabelle. There's also, the last thing was David Mann was on ZB talking to Heather Duplessis last night. Interesting interview. He's a New Zealand businessman based in China, Beijing, I think, sort of saying that there was a lot of work to do on New Zealand's part. This is Luxon's first visit as Prime Minister to China, that there had been generally, I think to paraphrase him, a dereliction on the part of New Zealand in terms of paying their due respect to the relationship with China, and that could, this is a point that Carter made too, that there is the risk, whether imminent or not, of retaliation in some form relating to our exports there and so on. I mean, Luxon's got a job to do from that point of view.
He does. It is curious that it has taken, more than 18 months for him to go and visit the country that we are most economically reliant on as a trade partner. You would think that would have been a higher priority. And so I think, and then, in the background, you've got what's been happening with AUKUS, so you would think that they would make the effort sooner to go and, warm up that relationship. So, yeah, I think that he'll be, there's going to be a need to defrost those relationships and try and rebuild some trust and respect with China.
Well, look, for a long time, I may have maintained my personal theory that in international relations, New Zealand needs to walk a tightrope between its economic interests with China and its strategic interests with the United States and the West. The calculation on this is becoming much more difficult. It's less sort of, walking a fine line between these two sort of interests, and now kind of, walking this insane sort of, minefield.
Wobbly board.
Yeah, where our strategic interests with the US are becoming a lot less clear as the United States in really kind of record time goes from, world police to sort of basically aspiring global hegemon and rogue state. It very much complicates the situation, right? In the sense that, in terms of this sort of framework with, AUKUS being the sort of, kind of symbol of it, I suppose, but of kind of, drawing closer to our Five Eyes, partners in terms of international security and particularly regional security in Asia Pacific. The picture is becoming much less clear because it was very straightforward. It was very straightforwardly, we had economic interests with China, but we supported the rules-based order for international relations. And of course, international law, it's fake, but it's very good if people and nations aspire to those sort of rules and that international, quote unquote, legal based order. And I mean, it's not clear that that's the dichotomy anymore. The United States is either turning a blind eye or urging on its allies in Israel, who are really kind of just going sort of crazy in the Middle East, flouting any sort of sense of what you would think of as, quote unquote, international law, but certainly norms and practices, and certainly what I think a country like New Zealand, which, is very much a taker of international affairs, not an offerer into the market. We need / benefit from an environment of stability. I think, most of the world benefits from an environment of stability. And it's pretty increasingly clear that the United States is not providing that.
Well, it's not clear what they're providing at all, is it? I mean, that's part of the difficulty in that Netanyahu seems to have operated, and, he said that the Americans are alert to what we're doing in Iran, that what they're doing in Iran, according to Netanyahu and the Israeli government, is attempting to disable an imminent nuclear threat. But in the past, there would have been a sense that that sort of action couldn't happen without the clear implied affirmation of the White House. Whereas now it seems to have happened. It's like we're confident that we can just go ahead this and put him in a position. You've got Trump responding by departing from the G7 a day early, because he's going to go back and address this issue with the posts on Truth Social about, Iran and Israel needing to make a deal. It just looks sort of shambolic, especially given, we should say, that the US and Iran were involved in talks that looked like they were progressing relating to Iran and its nuclear program.
Yeah, that's right. And, even right now, in terms of, I think Trump has said he wants something better than a ceasefire, and the two options for better than a ceasefire seem to operate along barbell theory, which is either evacuating Tehran, which will be completely leveled, or, an enduring peace. So, which way Western man? And that's that's even putting aside the economic situation in terms of, the tariff stuff, which continues apace. There's this sort of sense that the kind of tariff chaos has sort of wound down a little, but the tariffs on Chinese goods and China's tariffs on US goods are, much, much higher than they were 3 months ago. And those the sort of non-discriminatory tariffs of around at least 10% on the rest of the world, and even higher on selected countries. That's still largely in place as well, and so we're still dealing with a very, very different world to the one that we had in December. Even if the sort of headlines abate after sort of a month of reversals and reinstatements and just complete sort of policy churn, you still end up with a situation that's actually a long way away from what we would have considered a stable world, economic and strategic environment, even 6 months ago.
And so,
and the question is, what does New Zealand do about this? And the answer is we can't do much at all, right? Except try and not anger either of the two sort of massive powers on either side, the sort of Charybdis Scylla of our sort of we used to talk about Christopher Luxon talks about turning the ship around, in terms of the New Zealand government, in international relations, it's not a ship. New Zealand is a raft, right? It's like it's driftwood.
I thought aren't we a cork? We're famously a cork bobbing on the ocean. Was that Cullen's image? I'm not sure.
I think that, to be fair, I think New Zealand punches above its weight in this arena by because of the stances that we've taken in the past over issues like, nuclear weapons and all of that kind of thing, which is why, the issues that we've had recently with the Treaty Principles Bill and all of that, where it's seen as eroding the rights of tangata whenua, it does have an international impact, because we've always been held up as sort of the example of how you can have better relationships with your Indigenous nations. I think the things that we could be doing is we could cease all economic and trade relationships with Israel. This is, with Gaza in mind, not strictly about what's happening with Iran. We could open up some our doors to refugees from both Gaza and those who might want to flee Iran at the moment. We can put pressure on our allies such as the UK and the US, who continue to arm and support Israel. In terms of what's happening with Iran, Trump ripped up a deal, that was done with Iran about 8 years ago over their nuclear program. I think anytime we talk about weapons of mass destruction and nuclear programs in the Middle of the East, we should always approach it with a cool head, because let's not forget what happened. The reason why the US invaded Iraq was over weapons of mass destruction that didn't actually exist. So I think we need to bear that in mind when we see Israel using this as a reason to go in and bomb places where there's lots of civilians, including their national television service live. I think that Israel has put Trump in a real bind. He campaigned on the US not getting dragged into any more wars in the Middle East. But Israel seems to have no interest or care for the desires of its closest allies, or the guidance of its closest allies, even though it's completely dependent on the US if it wants to finish this latest attack on their nuclear facility. So it's going to be very interesting to see what plays out. Now, of course, when the attack was first launched, Trump seemed to be wanting to distance himself from it. Now that it appears to be somewhat successful, he's getting more invested. I don't think Trump would really want to go and be a part of that action. But until the signal chat is released to the public, we just won't know.
Read the signal chat. Well, remembering, of course, that there's tension within the Trump movement, because MAGA, America First as a movement, are all about, let's stay out of these international wars. We need to look after ourselves. So there's a tension there between that and the more kind of traditional Republican stance, which is so closely cleaved to the Israeli position. Remembering as well,
very, very opposed to getting involved.
That's right. And there's clearly tension within the administration and within the wider, movement, to put it that way. Remembering too that while I think the idea of a nuclear-armed Iran is terrifying, Israel is a nuclear-armed state.
Exactly.
That's just a fact of the matter. Thinking about Trump, he's just been absolutely. Remembering he was telling us that he was, and everyone's like, that was just rhetoric, but he was going to solve Ukraine-Russia within 24 hours. He was going to solve the situation in the Middle East with a snap of the fingers. And
to
clearly,
be fair,
he's way out of his depth.
To be fair, he was about to go and meet with Iran to restart the deal that he turfed out.
But that again
8 years ago, and before he could, Israel went in and killed the head of that delegation that he was due to be meeting with, which goes to show what a rogue state Israel is.
It shows Trump not to be the kind of genius deal maker, but I guess we knew that already.
In terms of New Zealand, it leaves us in a very difficult position, which is that Annabelle was saying we sort of punch above our weight because of our moral standing in the world over nuclear-free and, perhaps over sort of recognition of Indigenous rights. I think that's always been a little bit overstated by New Zealand.
Don't be like that. Don't be like that. Don't take that away. Don't steal that. Come on. We've got to have something.
But it depends. It depends, Ben, what you mean by our weight. If our weight is 5 million people in the world, we unambiguously punch above that particular weight, don't we?
But that's probably more to do with being a rich country as opposed to a highly moral country. But the other thing is that moral appeals, going back to, learning about international relations in my first year of university, they'd have this sort of simplistic kind of diagram of you have realist countries, which are based on sort of the exercise of power and strategic interests. You have idealistic countries, which are based on promoting human rights and a rules-based order, and then mercantilist countries, which are more sort of based on trade. No, all countries are a sort of mix of these different things, but idealism is the idea that you can exercise sort of moral weight in international affairs is something that has fallen out of favor in the West. By the West, I mean the United States, dramatically quickly.
That's true.
People have always made, the very good point that the, United States sort of deference to human rights or rules-based orders has always been highly contingent on its own national interests. But, of course, lip service is better than nothing, because then you still have the chance to shame people into different actions.
Yes, yeah.
Right now, there is no possibility of that. There is no mechanism by which, the Trump administration is shamed in international affairs right now, as we've seen, with the sort of displays in the White House over, with Vladimir Zelensky. And this leaves New Zealand in a very difficult position, because, that is the power that we have is diplomatic, it's moral, it's, appealing to sort of ideals of rules-based orders, things that just simply are not are not valued by the two major strategic and economic partners that we have in the same way that, of course, we as a small nation value them. And so, Winston Peters' sort of dark forest theory of international relations, where we just sort of kind of shelter in place and don't say anything and try and avoid being noticed, essentially. It has its merits at the moment.
Good point.
Yeah, it's true. I
Very good point.
I think that the sanctions that were imposed on that pair of Israeli politicians was one thing that went in the other direction a bit, and that was about the West Bank rather than Gaza. But that was an example of something that can be done, maybe in a small way, but by a group of countries that come together without the US in a slightly different dynamic. And it
was condemned by the US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio.
That's right. And in a way that might be small, and many people say that's nowhere enough, but it's something. Right? It's something. And then the Norwegians rocking in, who've got a good track record on this stuff, it's something. The interesting thing in terms of the way those dynamics work is that Luxon leaves China, goes to NATO. Now, that's another way in which we punch above our weight as we walk across the tightrope. There is, we have been invited. We're being invited back among a number of smaller countries to NATO to be part of that. It would be
critical that we're there.
They
need us.
We could rename it NZATO. I think that will be the future. But a year ago, and you touched on this, Ben, a year ago, it would be a different kind of calculus, because it would be seen as, the way this was being framed as, would be China on the one hand, NATO, of which the US is a member, on the other, and that whole kind of Clark and Brash line is we need to make sure but now NATO has been over time, the US is in many ways retreating from the NATO approach, so it becomes even more complicated. As far as
well, it's a bit orcs being part of NATO when you're trying to take over Greenland.
Yeah, it's complicated. It's a complicated situation in the whānau,
I reckon Natons, can I say? Natons, because we get tons of shit done when we're there.
And we need to add South Korea and Australia and a few others, but we'll work it out. We'll workshop that one. Ben, last time Luxon was abroad, or at least the last time he was on a significant trip abroad that I recall, was in India. And that was bringing this right back to a kind of domestic politics. He sort of was in a bit of trouble domestically. The polling wasn't great. There was a bit of murmuring. I think maybe it was after the unfortunate Hosking interview. And he had a slightly unfortunate Hosking interview the other day vis-a-vis his freestyling on the issue on the issue of sick pay. But is there anything that, if you were advising the Prime Minister about his perceptions within New Zealand, is there anything he can do in China, in Europe, to take on that statesman role again?
No, well, again, we're very much takers of these issues. I think Luxon can just reaffirm New Zealand values in the broad sense. Reaffirm. I think he's taken to using a very Matthew Houghton-esque line, like 191 other countries, we have an independent foreign policy. And have his photo taken, with world leaders, and speak knowledgeably about what he's been sort of hearing about and discussing. I think that tends to work well for him. You'll note that he is amongst Australians, one of the most, probably the most trusted global leader, I think.
Yes, that was a fantastic headline for him until you scrolled down and saw that not as trusted as Chris Hipkins, or just Chris went in that role. But it's like basically like New Zealand, the New Zealand, like they're not. Basically, it's a synonym for unthreatening, isn't it?
Well, look, I think it's really unfortunate to sort of compare two kings to try and bring one of them down,
right? Fair point.
Why try and dull the luster of either Chris Luxon or Chris Hipkins by comparing the two? But at the same time, I think that it does demonstrate, that Luxon isn't sort of falling down. He's
demonstrates one of the ways in which we punch above our weight, don't you think?
That's right. Sending trusted leaders into the Australian media awareness sphere.
Choosing a bottled Starbucks Frappuccino drink that's all flavor and just 100 calories? Easy. Choosing between creamy vanilla, double chocolate, and sea salt caramel flavors? A little harder. Try the delicious new Starbucks Frappuccino light drinks. Look for them wherever you buy groceries. Start with Starbucks coffee.
BTW, FYI. Visit Nexplanon.com RN to learn about Nexplanon. It's an adjustable implant, 68 milligrams radio pain. Or ask your HCP IRL. Okay. TTYL.
I wanted to become a member of the spin-off because I could see how important it is to have good journalism and to support media. It's the only way we can fight for our own voices, and we really, really need our own grassroots voice.
The Spin-Off. Not backed by billionaires, backed by you. Become a member today at thespinoff.co.nz/donate.
Are we going to talk about the interview about the sick leave, or?
Yeah, let's segue effortlessly into the interview about the sick leave. The way that played out was interesting, and I think I have this right, and correct me if I don't. Luxon was doing his media round ahead of his departure to China, and right at the end of his good matesy, hey, how are you doing? Nice one, nice to see you, mate, with Mike Hosking. Hosking, who is probably the best broadcaster in the country, just knocked in there. What are you going to do about the sick leave, mate? What's all, mate? All is well, mate. And Luxon's like, yeah, mate. It's, Brooke's looking at that. Brooke Van Velden's looking at that. And then cleverly, someone at RNZ on Morning Report picked up on that. I think this is right. And then he was asked more extensively about that. And then in his Morning Report interview, he went so far as to say, yes, we are looking at halving the sick leave entitlement. That is bringing it back to the level that it was before it was increased, doubled over COVID. Whereas, in fact, what they are considering doing, and Brooke Van Velden did a bunch of interviews subsequently in order to try and correct the record, is changing it so that part-time work is prorated. That is to say, at the moment, the sick leave entitlement is the same whether you work full-time or 3 days a week. And that's something that some business owners have been raising the alarm about. Is that right, Ben? Is that how you saw it happen?
So that's not how I experienced it live in my car, listening to Luxon on Morning Report.
Okay.
Where, there was this oddly specific, sort of slightly non sequitur question at the end, saying, are you looking at cutting 10 days sick leave entitlement under the Holidays Act, which was increased during COVID and made permanent, back down to 5 days, which was the position before the pandemic, 5 days per year. And Luxon said, well, that's something that we are looking at. Brooke Van Velden's looking at that, looking at sick leave. And then sort of brought it back and said, but what we are really, what we could see changes on is, prorating or proportionate sort of sick leave for people who work less than sort of full-time hours. And when I was listening to that, having been aware of the previous sort of discussion when Holidays Act changes were first mooted.
You're in you're in your car at this point. I'm
in my car. I'm in my car.
Yeah.
I'm spending quality time with my best friend, the Prime Minister, and our third mate, Corin Dan, who's doing most of the talking. And I heard that as, oh yes, Brooke is looking at sick leave, but what's actually being looked at is looking at, do you get the full-time entitlement if you're not a full-time worker? But I think that was my brain sort of filling in the blanks based on what I knew about the previous sort of discourse on it from when the policy was first announced. And I think this is actually an interesting, because when I read it quoted in a Herald article or RNZ's write-up or something.
The literal words, you mean?
Yeah, yes. I was like, oh, actually, it is much more ambiguous. It does look as if he's sort of saying...
It's not ambiguous. He said that was being looked at. Yeah.
Well, he said, yeah, that's something we are looking at. Now, I think what he meant... So I think...
At which point, Brooke Van Velden, who was in her car, went, what the...
Well, I think we often talk about the communication skills of politicians, right? And sometimes we're talking about just sort of, often we just mean the natural charisma, right, of a Jacinda Ardern or a John Key or something. But actually there are quite basic sort of communication skills that I think Luxon just wasn't using there, which is, people say it's annoying when politicians say the question back and then answer it, but that is a very good way of sort of delineating what you're talking about. So what would have been there was, what he would have said there, or could have said there was, oh yes, sick leave in general, that's something that Brooke Van Velden
the classic structure that I guess you advise people over the years is you say, well, what I can say is, what we are doing is, you reframe the question in that slight way.
And I think part of the thing is when you're a politician, when you're a minister, especially when you're prime minister, you get all these talking points. And actually, it is uncanny. Before I worked in the Beehive, I was always sort of thinking, how are they so ready at question time with all of their answers for all the supplementary questions and the things that come up? And what you realize is if you're paying attention to the news cycle, you kind of know what the opposition are going to ask, unless they've got secret knowledge that you're not aware of. It's generally going to be about the same sort of set of facts or, situations or policies. And this one, I think, came out of the blue because, of course, there are no plans to reduce sick leave from 10 days to 5 days. And so I think Luxon might have just been a bit caught out because he didn't have an answer for that because he wasn't expecting an answer for it because he wasn't expecting the question. So instead, his line on sick leave is that's something Brooke Van Velden is looking at, So I think, I do think it was a bit of a comms brain failure. But I don't think it was about the ministers being on separate pages. I think it was a bit of sort of carelessness in answering the question.
Is it because Luxon is not keeping across the details of what's happening, or is it because Brooke isn't sharing those details with them, do you think?
No, I mean, I think in terms of looking at I would think that the stage they're at in terms of looking at it, I think anything that was going to be sort of that significant probably would have been flagged at this point. But I think it's more a case of if the PM hears this and it's new and he sort of thinks, I don't have an answer for that. Is that something that's happening? You might sort of...
Isn't it more than that? It's more than that. I think it's also an instinct of knowing what that means, right? So in the current situation where pay equity has been overhauled and reduced in terms of its application, to what is the meaning of just saying that we might possibly, didn't make any commitment, that's sure, but we might possibly cut people's sick leave entitlements in half. How is that going to land? What does that mean for an ordinary person? Not Ben Thomas in his car, but, someone who's driving to work in the hospital in their car or whatever. And I think it's
huge because it's not just about you needing sick leave and you might get COVID and all of that stuff. It's about, particularly for women and mums and single mums, you need those days to be able to care for your children when your children are sick. So it's huge. And not just when your kids are sick. Like, we've taken dental nurses out of schools now. I don't know if anyone's tried getting a dental appointment for their kid recently, but it ain't easy. And it literally means that you have to go pull your kid out of school, not take them in the first place, drive out to a clinic somewhere, line up and spend, however long there, and then taking them back, which requires you to take time off work. Now, I mean, it's all good for us guys who have, flexibility and stuff, but for other workers, that's just not the case. And so it requires taking a day or a half day off work, and that usually ends up being taken as sick leave. So it's it would have been alarming for a lot of, I was alarmed by it when I heard it because for those reasons.
I think that's probably the reason that the government probably, would not be going near it, which is that, so most of the Employment Relations Amendment bill that was sort of tabled this week by Brooke Van Velden, I should say, he was a former colleague of mine at Exceltium a number of years back. It covers off situations where I think, most people would not immediately think of themselves as being exposed to. So, it changes rules around, for instance, personal grievances for unjustifiable dismissal, particularly for people over $180,000 a year, and also
terrible ACT party having a go at the wealthy again. How dare they? How dare they?
Yeah, I think Heather Duplessis-Allen pointed out that it is an interesting sort of, it'll hit a lot of their sort of public servant critics, but it will also, you would think it might affect a number of their voters, and it will be interesting to see if people on high salaries start negotiating into their contracts things like termination fees or something like that as a kind of workaround. But but that's the thing. I think it is they're reforming laws around things where people might think, well, that's not going to happen to me, whereas sick leave, annual leave, public holidays, I think they're going to leave well enough alone for exactly that reason, that they don't want the every person on the street to be alarmed.
Well, I think as far as dental work, we should turn Premier House back into a dental clinic, back into the murder house like it was once. That would be an act of great commitment. Should we wind it up?
Wind it up.
Yeah.
Hey, it's been fun. It's been nice to spend some time with you, listener. And we'll do it again very soon. Thanks, Tiahe. Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Annabelle. Kia ora.
Have a wonderful matariki.
The Spin-off Podcast Network.